Start recording. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Vicki Hallett, a member of the board for the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society. And on behalf of the entire board and our president, Heidi Coombs, who unfortunately has to send her regrets this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our March lecture entitled Food Fight, Food Rationing, Price Control, and Feeding Newfoundlanders in the Great War by Dr. Michael Westcott. Tonight's lecture will be recorded and posted on our website as soon as we can make that happen. But before I begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful partnerships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. The Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society began in 1905 with a mandate to promote knowledge and public discussion of the history and heritage of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we do this through a series of public lectures, symposia, publications, and through our annual Heritage Award. Some of these activities have been on hiatus this past year because of COVID-19, like so much else, such as our Heritage Award presentation. And we are looking forward to getting those things back up and running when it's safe to do so. Membership in the Historical Society, which is open to the public and only costs $40 a year, includes a subscription to the Venerable Newfoundland Quarterly. And if there is anyone watching who's not a member, we would certainly love to have you join the society. We are a nonprofit organization and we have limited resources, of course, and a small board of devoted volunteers. And this year we have been trying to get our lectures out across the province through Zoom, which has been an added expense for us. But we feel it's been an excellent opportunity for the Society to expand its reach across the province. And if you would like to become a member or make a small donation to help our work, absolutely please visit our website, www.nlhistory.ca. And of course, we would like to acknowledge the Department of Tourism, Culture and Industry and Innovation, which helps support our initiatives through the Cultural Economic Development Program. Our lecture series runs from September to April, except for December, and there's usually a schedule of our upcoming lectures available on our website. A few housekeeping notes in this cyberspace environment. It's really important that everyone stays on mute during the presentation because it can be quite disruptive if people have their microphones on. There is an option for you in Zoom to turn off your microphone. So if you have it on right now, please just check and turn it off if you haven't done so already. We will have a question and answer period after Dr. Westcott's lecture. And I will be monitoring the chat function. So if you have a question, please do type it into the chat if you're able, and I will field the questions. If you don't feel able to type it in, please do wait until we've got all those questions dealt with, and then by all means pipe up and ask a question at the end. Okay, so that is my little spiel. I'm going to turn it over to fellow board member Terry Bishop Sterling to introduce our speaker for this evening. Terry.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm very pleased tonight to introduce Michael Westcott. He's a postdoctoral scholar in the history department at Memorial University. Michael completed his graduate studies in the history department at Memorial. And in 2020, he successfully defended his PhD dissertation, Transforming the Liberal State, Gender, Class, and Ethnicity on the Newfoundland Home Front, 1914 to 1918. His research interests include the history of Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador, the impact of war on society, and the changing relationship between citizens and the state. He's also a former member of the board of the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society. And tonight he is going to share a part of his thesis research, which he has been busy over the last couple of years revising for publication. So please welcome Michael Westcott.
All right, are we good to go?
Yes, please go ahead, Michael.
Perfect. So I'm just going to talk a little bit tonight. This is a section of a chapter from my dissertation. The whole chapter was a little too long to to put into one lecture. So tonight I'm going to focus on food rationing, price control, and sort of what that tells us about Newfoundland society in the period. So before I get into the meat and bones of the lecture, I'd just like to introduce a few topics to set a bit of a background. So ever since European settlers first arrived in Newfoundland, despite the rich maritime resources, they've always been dependent on food imports from Britain, the United States, and Canada. The reason for this is that roughly 1/3 of the island has no agricultural capacity whatsoever, and only small pockets have enough fertile soil for growing crops. In addition to this, Newfoundland's cold and wet climate leaves it with a very short growing season. So this meant that even though settlers could augment their diets by raising sheep, pig, and cows, this is often difficult if you lived in an area where you couldn't produce the grain to feed them, because it's very expensive to feed pigs, sheep, or cows imported grains. Some other things that people could do to augment their diets included picking berries. They could grow small quantities of vegetables, but they were really reliant on imports of salt pork and beef, flour, tea, molasses, sugar, butter, oatmeal, peas, hops, malt, beer, wine, and tobacco, and all those good things. Next thing I'd just like to introduce is a little bit about politics on the home front in Newfoundland. One of the really important things to know is that politics on the home front was really defined by a wartime political contest between two major parties. One were the Progressives. They were closely associated with William Coker, his newspaper, the Mail and Advocate, and members of the Fisheries Protective Union. And they really believed that social problems needed collective solutions. They advocated for state regulation of the economy, and they believed that the state could be harnessed to improve the lives of the poor citizens. On the other side of this divide were the Liberals, and they were closely associated with the Prime Minister Edward Morris, his People's Party, and really the business community in Newfoundland. They were classically liberal in orientation, and I sort of define classical liberalism as being made up of three main tenets. First being liberty, which is the paramount tenet of liberalism, was that all individuals should be able to do as they please, as long as their actions don't restrict upon the freedoms of others. So this includes things like freedom of speech, free markets, and freedom of labor. So the next tenet of the Liberals was equality, and they believe that all individuals should be treated equally under the law. There's a really big caveat to this, because throughout the history of liberalism, they never considered all humans to be an individual. The status of an individual was always based on your ethnicity, your class, and your gender. So liberal states often denied these rights to women, minorities, and I call them the producing class instead of the working class, and also the poor. So I use the term liberal individual to someone who has full rights under a liberal state. And sort of the final tenet is property, and that's all individuals have the right and to own property. So the Liberals in Newfoundland really strongly believed in free markets, and they believed that the best way for prosperity for Newfoundland was for the government to keep their fingers out of the markets. Finally, unlike the Progressives, Liberals believed that social problems were individual problems. They could be solved through voluntary charitable contributions, but they really did believe that the state had no role in solving most individual problems. The next thing I'd like to introduce is the Foodstuffs Act. So in the beginning of the First World War, the Newfoundland House of Assembly and Legislative Council held an emergency meeting to pass legislation needed for the war effort. So this is where we see the introduction of legislation that allowed the creation of the Newfoundland Regiment. One of the things they also did was pass the Foodstuffs Act, and that allowed them to set maximum prices for food and seize any food or other necessities of life that were being held from the market unreasonably. So what this means is that although from the very beginning of the war, the government had the power to interfere with the free markets, but they lacked all desire to do so. The next thing I'd like to introduce is just the tonnage crisis. So in 1914, the Russian government was critically short of steel-hulled steamships that they could use as icebreakers in the North Sea. As a result, the Russian government approached several Newfoundland ship owners, offering them prices that far exceeded the market values of their ships. Several ship owners could not resist the temptation of these profits and sold their vessels to the Russian government. For example, the Reed Company sold the Lint Rose, which is pictured here in my little PowerPoint. They sold the Lint Rose and the Bruce. A.J. Harvey sold the Bonaventure, Adventure, and Bellaventure. The Joe brothers sold the Beothic, and Bain Johnson sold the Icelandic. While the sale of these ships was really profitable for their owners, it was quite devastating for Newfoundland. The majority of these ships were used to transport food, coal, and other goods from Canada and the United States to Newfoundland. With the sale of these ships, there was a significant reduction in tonnage, that is, the total cargo available to bring goods to Newfoundland. And this reduced the amount of space merchants could have to import food. And even though merchants attempted to replace their vessels, they were often much too small or ill-suited for this purpose. So as a result, by 1915, freight started piling up on docks in North Sydney as companies were having trouble securing tonnage to get their cargo, including food, to Newfoundland. So the First World War drastically caused the cost of living to go up in Newfoundland. This was largely due to decreased crop production in Europe and the increased food requirements of soldiers fighting a war and refugees. And this all really increased the international price of food. As a result, here in Newfoundland, the price of potatoes, vegetables, salt, sugar, molasses, both fresh and salt meat, milk, margarine, tea, bread, and importantly, flour skyrocketed. While the prices of nearly all food increased, nothing outraged Newfoundlanders as much as the price of flour. Without the ability to produce significant quantities of wheat, grains, legumes, or vegetables, wheat flour made up a significant portion of people's diets. In a study from about 1913, a doctor found that most people in Newfoundland would take on supplies before the winter, say, in December, and they might not take on more food until May or June. This is in rural and isolated places. While they were able to sometimes raise, livestock or, harvest vegetables, it was very difficult to store enough food for the whole winter. So by the late spring, a lot of families were surviving on nothing but tea and bread. In early 1914, flour regularly sold for about $5 a barrel, which is 89 kilograms. Within a week of the war's start, many families across the Dominion worried that the war would cause a flour shortage, and they rushed to their local merchant to purchase as much flour as they could afford. Within 2 weeks of the war, the start of the war, I should say, flour prices had risen by 44% to $7.20 a barrel. This increase in price exacerbated demand as many citizens attempted to buy more flour before prices increased again. The panic buying of flour across the Dominion caused shortages. If you tried to purchase toilet paper in March of 2020, this should be fairly familiar to you. Some communities had no flour whatsoever after it was reported that wealthy citizens bought the entirety of a community stock and were hoarding it in their basement. There were many reports submitted to the government that in towns where the government was distributing flour to the poor, men were caught repeatedly changing their clothes in order to try and confuse these flour distributors so that they could collect as much flour as they could. In some ways, it was understandable that Newfoundlanders would want to stock up on flour. By January of 1915, the price of flour had risen to $7.50, and by 1916, it was $8.50. By 1917, it jumped as high as a staggering $16 a barrel. This is over a 220% increase since the start of the war. To put this into a modern equivalent, A 5 pound bag, 5 kilogram bag of Robin Hood flour, according to Sobeys website, costs today around $10. And this would be the equivalent of that rising to about $32. And you can imagine if we found out that flour tomorrow would be sold for $32, you wouldn't find a bag of Robin Hood in Newfoundland. So right from the beginning, progressives in Newfoundland demanded that the government use the Foodstuffs Acts to control the price of flour. A.W. Muse, editor of the Mail and Advocate, which was the Fishermen's Protective Union's official newspaper, accused flour merchants of using the war as an excuse to raise prices and rake in profits. He questioned their patriotism. He argued that merchants, like soldiers, had a patriotic duty to Newfoundland. While soldiers had to sacrifice their lives, merchants had to sacrifice a portion of their profits to ensure Newfoundlanders could afford to eat. This was an incredibly widespread argument. Some people have suggested that every time that there was a lull in recruiting, it was because people didn't think that their families were being taken care of when they were away fighting the war. By 1917, Muse warned that flour could likely rise as high as $18 or $20 a barrel by the end of the war. He advocated that the government had a duty to the people to set a maximum price. On the other hand, liberals in the Dominion believed that the government should not and could not interfere in free markets. They argued that the high price of flour was caused by a rise in prices on the international market. They believed that prices should be allowed to rise and decline naturally as the war progressed. They warned the Prime Minister that setting a maximum price on flour would threaten merchants' ability to make a profit, resulting in them potentially refusing to import flour at all. This, they argued, would make shortages worse. So Prime Minister Edward Morris remained skeptical that the 220% rise in the price of flour was an issue. He told the House of Assembly that the high price of flour was proof that Newfoundland's economy was booming. He reasoned that if people could not afford flour, the high prices of coal or salt, they simply wouldn't buy it. And he said the fact that people were still buying flour proves that they could afford it. He seems to be ignorant of the fact of how important a staple white flour was in rural parts of the island. He also said that even though the price of living was increasing, so too was the price of fish. Before the war, fishers were getting around $6 a quintal, and they were now getting $9 a quintal, which is roughly a 50% increase. William Coker, the leader of the Fishermen's Protective Union, disagreed with the Prime Minister. He said that even though the price of fish was going up, it was not keeping a pace with the cost of living. He estimated that the price of fish would have to go up to $12 a quintal before fishers and their family could maintain a reasonable standard of living. He challenged Morris, questioning why he was willing to fix the price of coal in 1915, but now in 1916 and 17, he was unwilling to do so for flour. He estimated that merchants were making roughly between $2 to $3 million in excess profits each year because of these price hikes. Edward Morris was less than convinced by Coker's calculations, but he did agree to form a high cost of living commission. P.T. McGraw, a local politician and newspaper editor, was put in charge of the 5-member commission, who were tasked with investigating the high cost of living on the island. By June of 1917, the commission released a report indicating that there were 3 main causes for the elevated prices of flour. The first was the global shortage of wheat due to the war. They told the government that there was little they could do about that because there's nothing that Newfoundland could do to control the prices of wheat on the global market. The next was the rise in freight rates. Prior to the war, the Reed Company was charging between 20 and 30 cents per barrel to bring flour from North Sydney to Newfoundland. By 1917, the freight rates per barrel had risen to $1.28. Similarly, the Red Cross line was charging 26 cents to bring flour from New York to Newfoundland. That's before the war. And by 1917, it was charging $1.32. The commission admitted that there were increased operational expenses due to the war, one being a lack of tonnage, and the other being increased insurance due to the threat of U-boat attacks. But they concluded that there was nothing that could possibly justify a 300 to 400% increase on shipping rates. The final reason, and perhaps the most damning reason, was merchant price fixing. The commission found that merchants were working together to fix flour prices that far exceeded the international market, resulting in massive profits. Prior to the war, merchants often made about $1 profit for every barrel they imported. The commission found that it was not uncommon for merchants to make $4 or $5 profit per barrel during the war. They said there was absolutely no justification that they could find for this massive increase in profits. In addition to their findings, the commission made several recommendations to the Prime Minister. Firstly, they said that he should form a food control board, and they advocated that he give the board the power to fix prices, conserve and distribute food, make a detailed survey of all stocks of food in the Dominion, ensure adequate stocks, prohibit citizens from stockpiling flour, and license all food distributors. Following the Commission's recommendations, there was a significant public discourse on how to solve the issue of flour prices. As before, progressives argued that the board should step in immediately once formed and regulate the price of flour that all citizens could afford it. The Newfoundland Industrial Workers Association supported the creation of a food control board. They warned the government that the outrageous price of food was harming producers and chastised the government for having the power to control the price of food, but refusing to do so. They recommended that the board comprise 15 members, with 10 of them coming from trades, labor, and fishing unions. And they thought this would prevent mercantile interests from dominating the board. They also called on honest flour merchants to distance themselves from who they called, and it's the quote, lepers and pariahs who were bleeding Newfoundlanders dry while their sons were bleeding in the trenches. On the other hand, Liberals argued that the government should focus on maintaining a steady supply of flour. So they wanted the government to help merchants obtain stock to sell to the people. H.A. Winter, the editor of the Evening Telegram, recommended that the board focus on conserving flour so that all citizens had access to limited stocks. In the Legislative Council, A.J. Harvey opposed the creation of a food control board and defended the high profits merchants were making on flour. His first reason for defending these profits was that he argued that the risk of wartime shipping, a ship potentially being sunk by a U-boat, required increased prices in case they lost a ship. However, he also said that merchants needed these extra profits to reinvest money back into the Dominion. In particular, Harvey argued that merchants were using these profits to replace the vessels sold to the Russian. So just as a reminder, Harvey sold 3 of his vessels to the Russian government for massive, massive profits. He made a lot of money on that deal. And he had the gall to stand up in the Legislative Council and defend him price fixing flour so he could make even more money to replace those vessels. It's a little bizarre. So after the release of the commission's reports, a group of 38 flour merchants, dealers, and retailers met at the Board of Trade building in St. John's. They released a statement saying that there was never a price fixing scheme and that nobody at the meeting had spoken with each other to set prices. In response to the commission's claim that flour merchants were raking in record profits, flour dealers said that they were, at times, selling flour for $4 under market value, which they pointed out was at great personal risk to themselves. They advocated against price control, saying that the market had to dictate prices because there was no way merchants could sell flour for less than it currently was, because it would be consistently under market value. They agreed to work with the Food Control Board, but strongly recommended that half of the board comprise flour retailers, which seems a little bit like asking the fox to guard the hen house. Despite the objections of the Liberals, the formation of a national government in 1917 made Edward Morris much more willing to take issue on the price of food. He created the Food Control Board and passed the Trading of the Necessaries of Life Bill. This bill gave the board the power to investigate stocks of food, to control the import of food, to ensure adequate stocks, take complete control of the distribution of food, control all prices, ration all necessities, and they could even implement penalties for not following regulations that they set. Now, contrary to the wishes of both flour dealers and the Newfoundland Industrial Workers Association, the board consisted only of 3 people: P.T. McGrath, Henry LeMessurier, and Jeff Grimes. Neither were flour merchants, nor were they union members. Once established, the Food Control Board set their first task as to determine how much flour Newfoundland will require each year and to secure supplies for merchants for that flour. In the summer of 1917, newspapers in the Dominion published reports that Canada and the United States were 400 million bushels of wheat short of what they promised to supply to their allies. Many people worried that Herbert Hoover, the head of the US Food Administration, and William Hanna, the Canadian food controller, would restrict the amount of flour for export to Newfoundland. This fear was realized when P.T. McGrath traveled to Ottawa to inquire about obtaining enough flour for Newfoundland's merchants. Hanna told McGrath that wheat shortages in Canada had caused the government to drastically reduce flour consumption. He had set a goal to reduce Canadian flour consumption from 6 3/4 bushels per person per year to 4 3/4 bushels per person per year. He strongly recommended that Newfoundland do the same, as Canada would be forced to reduce flour imports to Newfoundland. McGrath told Hanna that Newfoundland was far too dependent on white flour, and that much of a reduction was completely impossible. Still, he conceded that if Newfoundland could increase their potato crops, he believed that they could reduce flour consumption by 10%. Later, when McGrath sent a cable back to Governor Davidson, he told him that while a 10% decrease in flour consumption might be possible, he said it would be wildly unpopular. Following the meeting between McGrath and Hanna, the Food Control Board abandoned the idea of controlling prices and focused entirely on reducing flour consumption to make limited stocks last and to save wheat for the war effort. Initially, the board tried to get Newfoundlanders to voluntarily reduce their flour consumption. It warned people that the war effort was dangerously short on flour, and as a result, Newfoundland would receive greatly diminished stocks from Canada and the United States. The board also warned that the US and Canada might, as a punishment, reduce exports even further if Newfoundlanders refused to do their bit and eat less flour. Most newspapers in the Dominion took up the cause of reducing flour consumption as both a matter of necessity and an act of patriotism and sacrifice. A.W. Muse told the readers of the Mail and Advocate that every citizen in the Dominion had a duty to reduce their flour consumption by 25%, and those who refused to do so were traitors both to Newfoundland and to Britain. H.A. Winter, editor of the Evening Telegram, wrote that he was disgusted with what he considered to be the extravagant consumption of flour in Newfoundland. He suggested that every household dedicate 1 day each week to be wheat-free and 1 meal each day to be flourless. In addition to this, the Food Control Board enlisted the help of the Women's Patriotic Association to create a series of menus that appeared several times a week in newspapers. Each menu had recipes for breakfast, lunch, and supper, and were designed to use as little flour as possible and highlight the use of alternatives to flour. One menu consisted of porridge, herring, and potatoes with tea for breakfast, pea soup, vegetables, gingerbread pudding, and tea for lunch, and sausages, potatoes, and corn dodgers with jam for supper. Despite these good intentions, these recipes were criticized ruthlessly by rural Newfoundlanders. They argued that the ingredients were either not available outside St. John's or were too expensive for the average fishing family to afford. They suggested these recipes would only be useful to upper-class families in St. John's and would do absolutely nothing to reduce flour consumption outside of the city. These calls to patriotism failed to convince Newfoundlanders to eat less flour. In a last-ditch effort, the board held a Victory War Bread show. This was a show that they had several categories, and prizes were given out for the best recipes for baked goods that used flour substitutes in part or in whole. It's interesting to point out that the prizes given out were barrels of flour. It seems a little counterproductive to give out barrels of flour as a prize in a competition designed to reduce the amount of flour being eaten, but I guess they had to give the people what they wanted. The contest was incredibly popular, and over 350 women across the Dominion registered. However, the Food Control Board, there didn't seem to be any reduction in flour consumption whatsoever. In fact, it seemed to be the quite opposite. The board was flooded with reports of citizens across the island who were hoarding mass amounts of flour. They routinely heard of women who traveled from store to store, purchasing small to medium amounts of flour in an attempt to hide their hoarding. Seemingly unable to convince Newfoundlanders to eat less flour, the board decided to force them to eat less flour. On 1 July 1918, on the recommendation of the Food Control Board, the Newfoundland government passed the Substitutes Act. This act made it mandatory for merchants to sell 1 pound of substitutes, such as cornmeal, oatmeal, barley, etc., for every 4 pounds of wheat flour. Similarly, the act required everyone to use 20% substitutes to 80% wheat flour in all of their baking. If a merchant was caught selling flour without substitutes, or a citizen was caught baking without substitutes, or even simply being in possession of baked goods that didn't contain substitutes, I don't know how they would know that, they faced an incredibly high fine of $1,000, 3 months in prison, or both. The Substitutes Act outraged many Newfoundlanders. They felt the government had no right to force them to purchase and eat substitutes. The editor of the Harbour Grace Standard acknowledged that many people in Conception Bay were happy to simply eat less flour, but were incensed at being forced to eat grains that they normally fed to animals. The editor reported that it was in fact common practice for people to purchase flour and substitutes, eat the flour themselves, and feed the substitutes to their pigs. The editor of the Harbour Grace Standard also complained that it took an expert baker to make edible bread out of war flour mixed with substitutes. He challenged the Food Control Board to produce a recipe that used war flour and substitutes that made a decent loaf. So war flour, also known as victory flour, it was a white flour with wheat bran added. It was somewhere in between white bread and whole wheat. And the purpose of this was to bulk up flour so Canada could produce more flour stocks, or more barrels of flour. And this was the majority of flour imported in Newfoundland, and it was very common throughout the British Empire. In response to the complaints of the editor from the Harbour Grace Standard, Jeff Grimes published an article in the Evening Advocate. He said that all across the British Empire, women were mixing war flour with substitutes and their bread was delicious. He said that if someone couldn't make good bread with flour and substitutes, then the issue was with their baking skills and not the ingredients. While unpopular, the majority of Newfoundlanders followed the Substitutes Act and looked forward to the end of the war so the regulation could be lifted. After the war ended, however, the Food Control Board announced that the requirement to purchase and eat substitutes would continue for several months. The board argued that lifting the Substitutes Act would result in a vast shortage of flour. They promised to lift the regulation once merchants could import enough flour to feed everyone. Many people in Newfoundland didn't buy this argument. They strongly believed that merchants influenced the Food Control Board to keep the regulation in place so merchants wouldn't be stuck with stocks of substitutes that no one wanted to buy. In December of 1918, H.M. Mosdell, the editor of the Daily Star, complained about this regulation, and it's a quote from him, quote, "The people of Newfoundland are still forced by local authorities to use 20% of this hog food with all the flour they consume. Some flour importers insert that the people of this country will still be using this hog feed when another Christmas season rolls around." Coming to the defense of the Food Control Board once again was Jeff Grimes. He wrote in the Evening Advocate, I quote, "Sir, I have noticed in recent editorials that you have much to say about hog feed. And having eaten more than one meal of this feed, rolled oats, cornmeal, etc., as a breakfast food, and as a constituent part for bread to the extent of 1 part to 4, I did not find that it produced within me any of the hog propensities for wallowing in mire. I do not know what kind of batch you got, but I am inclined to think that from your editorials that you may have struck a bad barrel or sack somewhere." On 19 February 1919, the regulation was finally lifted, and the Evening Advocate quite sarcastically rejoiced that Mr. Mosnell no longer had to share a meal with his pigs. In addition to reducing the amount of flour that people consumed, both citizens and the government searched for new foods to replace both flour and meat. I use the word new loosely. None of these foods were quite new. One of the first new foods that they discussed was a byproduct from the cod fishery. Andrew Barrett, the editor of the Western Star, which was based in Curling, modern-day Corner Brook, he chastised fishers for throwing away perfectly good cod's heads, tongues, and sounds. He argued that it was absolutely unacceptable for fishers to waste food when the world was starving. He advocated that boys, girls, and women could harvest these parts to provide food and additional income for the family. He thought these parts were so valuable that he estimated over $2 million of heads, tongues, and sounds were thrown back into the water every year. Despite his pleas, it doesn't seem that fishers, at least on the West Coast, began to eat any of these parts of the codfish, to a large extent. Throughout the war, Barrett published the occasional editorial, and I guess this kind of stuck in his craw, attacking fishers for throwing away heads, tongues, and sounds, and he called Newfoundlanders the most wasteful people on the planet. Another new source of food that was considered was found abundantly off Newfoundland's coast, and that was seal meat. In 1915, a letter to the editor of the Evening Telegram, written under the pseudonym Economy, suggested that sealers should bring back meat from the ice. They estimated that nearly 12.5 million pounds of fresh, nutritious seal meat was being left on the ice every year, and they believed it should be illegal to waste so much food when people were starving during a war. Over the next 3 years, many newspapers received letters calling for the harvest of seal meat. The editors of the Evening Telegram, Western Star, and Harbour Great Standard all call on the government to use the War Measures Act to force sealing vessels to harvest seal meat. They felt that the scarcity of fresh meat and the prohibitive price and poor quality of wartime salt meat would create a big market for fresh seal meat. Still, not everyone was convinced by this. A.W. Muse argued that Newfoundlanders simply would not eat seal meat unless there were no other alternatives and they were starving. In addition, he didn't believe that merchants had enough cold storage on shore to prevent all that meat from spoiling before it reached consumers. Given the public interest, the Food Control Board decided to conduct an investigation on the mass harvesting of seal meat. And they interviewed the infamous Captain Abram Kane. He told the board that sealers could earn vastly more money from pelts than they could from meat, and so they had very little incentive to bring this meat back. He said that if they were to make this a commercial success, the price of seal meat would be so prohibitively expensive that no one would be able to afford to eat it. In addition to this, he also said that the conditions on a sealing vessel were not suited to bringing back meat to Newfoundland, and he said that there's no way that they could prevent the meat from spoiling on the journey from the front to shore. Following this interview with Kane, the Food Control Board determined that it was unfeasible to harvest significant quantities of seal meat, and the issue was dropped in local newspapers. One final food that was promoted as an alternative flour was already grown in Newfoundland and already part of their diets, and that was potatoes. As I discussed before, P.T. McGraw believed that flour consumption could be curbed if Newfoundlanders increased potato production. In 1916, the board and the Agricultural Board, that is the Food Control Board and the Agricultural Board, and Governor Davidson himself started a propaganda campaign to convince Newfoundlanders to plant more potatoes. They argued it was the patriotic duty of every single Newfoundlander, every man, woman, and child, to plant potatoes on every square inch of fertile soil in the Dominion. They told people that planting potatoes was a service to the war effort because every barrel of flour not eaten in Newfoundland was a barrel of flour that could be sent to a hungry soldier in the trenches. The Agricultural Board pitched potatoes as a way for Newfoundland to insulate themselves from the threat of U-boat warfare. They said that if U-boats destroyed every shipment of flour from the US or Canada, Newfoundland could still have enough potatoes to feed themselves, and they would not need to turn to Britain for aid. Governor Davidson even tried to enlist churches to help with this potato campaign. He wrote to churches all across Newfoundland and asked the priests and ministers to give sermons on planting potatoes. They told people that they should plant more potatoes than they could actually eat. Homegrown potatoes could save families money, and their excess crops be sold for a profit in St. John's. This campaign, unlike the campaign for seal meat or the saving of cod tongues, was wildly successful. It started in early 1916, and by the end of the year, Newfoundland's potato crop was estimated to be nearly 500,000 barrels larger than it was in the previous year. People in Newfoundland really embraced potatoes as an alternative to flour, and this is evidenced by an increase in demand for potatoes despite the increased supply. This resulted in an increase in the price of potatoes despite having more potatoes than ever before. This further increased people's incentive to plant. In addition to these proposals, newspapers and government officials received a myriad of suggestions from citizens on ways they could increase domestic food production. Some examples include banning the keeping of dogs and encouraging people to keep sheep or pigs so they could be butchered for meat. Some wanted to start sugar beet plantations so sugar could be produced locally. Some wanted game laws to be changed so Newfoundlanders could hunt rabbit year-round as a food source. Some people encouraged Newfoundlanders to raise chickens for meat and eggs. And it seems that throughout the war, there was a near constant demand for Newfoundland to start raising their own wheat and producing their own flour. But given the agricultural state of Newfoundland, it wasn't possible to grow enough wheat to supply Newfoundland or to do it at a price that was competitive. So what can we learn about from food and price control and food rationing in Newfoundland? I would argue that food rationing and price control was part of the negotiation of the new social contract between citizens and the state in Newfoundland. As part of this contract, citizens were expected to provide soldiers for the Newfoundland Regiment and the Royal Naval Reserve, donate money to the war effort. The Women's Patriotic Association was expected to send clothing and comforts to the soldiers, and everyone was expected to conserve food. In return for their patriotism, sacrifice, and service, citizens expected the government to take a greater role in protecting citizens from conditions on the home front. This crystallized in demand for the government to protect people from food shortages and high prices. In the case of flour, the government turned away from controlling prices and towards rationing. Although late in the war, about 3 to 4 weeks before the war ended, they did set a maximum price on flour, but the price they set was $15 a barrel, plus any transportation or storage fees, which was roughly the same price as flour in 1918 anyway. I also think that this social contract dramatically altered the liberal state. Before the war, the liberalism was focused on the rights of the narrowly defined liberal individual. However, this new social contract required the sacrifice and service of many people, such as women, the producing class, ethnic minorities, who were not previously granted the status of an individual and full rights in a liberal state. As a result of a total war effort, more people were granted at least partially the status of a liberal individual. As a result, liberalism shifted its focus from the rights of the individual to the rights of the community, as they acknowledged that the community was made up of individuals. Therefore, the best way to protect the individual was to protect the community. This is evidence that the First World War, at least temporarily, shifted liberal governance away from classical liberalism towards a burgeoning social liberalism that focused on state solutions to social problems and a focus on the rights of the community over the rights of the individual. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Michael. That's wonderful. I'm going to stop recording now And we'll take any questions that anyone in our audience might have tonight.